So the question for you is, who do you think was sitting in the first place in the number one position? Now, what you have to understand is that back then people sat in position of honor. So you sit at the closest, the most important person at the party or at the event, at a dinner event, at the table is always the host, right? That's the most important person. The second most important person is the guest of honor. There's always a guest of honor. And then you sit in descending order of importance. That's why, if you remember the banquet parable, where Jesus says, go to the end of the table and ask the least important to come sit at the front. That he's talking about this setup that they did at the time. So, if you don't know who sat at the first, who do you think sat at the second position? No, Jesus sat at the second position. Jesus was the guest of honor, and he always, not the guest of honor, he was the host. He was the one throwing the party. So he sat at number 2. The person sitting next to him is the beloved disciple John. And what was his job? That's not a highly revered position. That was the person who had to go to the kitchen, thus they sat the closest to the kitchen, to go get the food, and they're basically the server. They're the Applebee's guys, okay? And so they are there to serve everybody the meal. And they had to get up for the multiple courses. And so the second person is usually the host. In this case, it was Jesus. Who do you think was sitting in the 13th position? It was Peter. And the clue that we get is that when Jesus got up toward the end of the dinner, he goes and washes the feet of, or he tries to initially to wash the feet of Peter. And Peter says, no, I'm supposed to do that. And why would he sit at the 13th position? Notice the door, right? You washed people's feet when they entered into your home or some important place. So the person sitting closest to the door had the least honored position, and they usually were a slave or a servant of some sort, and they were responsible for washing everybody's feet when they came in. Because back then they didn't have Nikes and Adidas. Right? They had open-toes shoes, and if they were lucky, it was like your Birkenstocks. It wasn't anything like that. It was, most people walked just in their bare feet. So every time you entered anybody's homes, you had to have your feet washed. And so, in this case, the 13th position was the person who had to wash the feet. And we know, based on the gospel stories, we suspect it was Peter. He is the least position, and it's interesting then that he's the one that Jesus picks to start the church, to give the office of the keys, right? Later in Luke, we learn that.